the largest anti-government protest yet in Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is refusing to accept the Gaza ceasefire deal that's on the table, which includes the release of captives. What could force his hand, or even force him out of office? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Calls for a Gaza ceasefire are growing louder in Israel. As many as 750,000 people came out in major cities on Saturday, demanding that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agree to a deal to bring home the remaining captives. But he remains defiant, insisting the war will continue until Hamas is eliminated. So what will it take for Netanyahu to sign an agreement? Could pressure from Israel's allies, including the US, make a difference? We'll explore all these issues with our panel of guests. Today, joining us from Tel Aviv, we have Dan Perry, author of Israel and the Quest for Permanence. He's a former regional bureau chief for the Associated Press. In West Jerusalem, Ilan Baruch is chairman of the Policy Working Group, which advocates for policies based on a two-state solution. He's a former Israeli ambassador to South Africa. And in London, Professor Yossi Meckelberg is an associate fellow at the Chatham House think tank who specialises in Israeli and Middle East politics. Thank you, all three of you. Welcome to Inside Story Israel. I'm always very wary of crowd sizes because there are always big estimates involved and different people tell you different things. But some reports saying 500,000, some saying 750,000 people protesting in Tel Aviv as well as other towns and cities. He was quoted as saying, most Israelis are not swayed by Hamas propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu himself is a master propagandist. I don't expect Netanyahu to be very much impressed with protests. And in general, it must be said that protests very rarely cause, the collapse of governments and democratic societies. And Israel, whatever else can be said, is one. And basically, Netanyahu can be expected to ignore the protests, refer to them with disdain here and there, and try to hang on until the next scheduled election, which is in late 2026, regardless of the size of these protests. And I agree, they were probably larger than the classic center-left protests because many people in Netanyahu's own camp who are generally aligned with the right wing are quite disgusted by the just multifaceted failure of this government since the utter debacle of October 7th all the way to the current war, which whatever achievements they may be able to point to in the degradation of Hamas, leaves Israel 11 months down the road in a situation where if Israel pulled out, Hamas would still be in power. So spin that as you will, doesn't look like much of a success.
What people expect is, regardless of what is going on in Gaza, regardless of the political ramifications for Netanyahu, end the war, bring back the hostages. If they persist, and if at the same time the international community persists, mainly the Americans, then we might see a movement on the ground.
Dan, let me ask you about the roles of the families of those who've died and those who have been held. How important are they in mobilising these mass protests, would you say?
They're extremely important because they provide a human face, and that's how our societies work. I mean, some of these families have become basically celebrities, and they're very, very good at presenting their case, and some are very telegenic, and they're so passionate and determined. And the tragedy that they've endured is something almost anyone can connect with. So yeah, it is effective in creating these protests. But at the end of the day, what has just been said is also very, very true. If Israel does the deal that's on the table, Hamas has not changed its basic perspective for many, many months, which is end the war, pull out of Gaza, leave us in power, again, degraded, but still in power, get back your hostages. That will look like a defeat for Israel. And in a way it would be, but the fly in the ointment of that argument is that if Hamas is still in a position to stay, to remain in power, if Israel leaves, creating a vacuum, that's partly because of Israel's own policy of avoiding any discussion or any planning for a day after scenario where there's an alternative to Hamas in Gaza. And an obvious candidate would be a framed, rejiggered, rejuvenated Palestinian Authority, but Netanyahu has not been able to go an inch in that direction because the extreme right that holds the government by the neck has threatened to bring him down, and those threats are credible. So Israel is in quite a pickle where no matter where it goes, it's going to look like it failed in the conduct of the war. Now, they certainly, punished Hamas. And by the way, the 41,000 figure includes Hamas militants. So it's not all civilians, but a lot of civilians have been killed as well. And there is in Israel some introspection about that. But also, I have to add a considerable degree of disbelief in the numbers coming out of Gaza, and also something of a disappointment in the world community that seems to not understand what Israelis believe is true, which is that civilians are dying because Hamas uses them as human shields, hides beneath them, and wants them to be killed because that is good PR for them versus Israel.
What is Netanyahu's biggest vulnerability? Briefly, please.
His biggest vulnerability is if the Americans lose patience and cease sending munitions and cease their veto at the UN Security Council. That would be a game changer. I doubt it's going to happen. Certainly not before the U.S. election. Quite possibly not even after. But you never know. The other vulnerability is, life kind of goes on, and there are rules in Israel. And if he fails to pass a budget, then the government will collapse, and there will be elections by March, I believe, of 2025, and that actually could happen because of things that have nothing to do with the war and have everything to do with Israel's other myriad problems, in particular what to do about the ultra-Orthodox community that refuses to serve in the military and presents many, many other challenges. This budget thing actually could be the deus ex machina that fixes the problem.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on Inside Story Israel. Our guests were Dan Perry, Ilan Baruch and Yossi Meckelberg. Al Jazeera's coverage of the war on Gaza and the situation across the region continues here around the clock.